Second, we pivot, though, from the occupation of the office of the vice president to the occupation of the banks. Today, hundreds of protesters demonstrating outside Wells Fargo's shareholder meeting in San Francisco, California, voicing frustration over foreclosures, big executive compensation, and a host of other issues that go to the root of the economic dysfunction in this country, exposed in 2008 and covered up by both parties ever since. The annual shareholder meeting is slated to begin at Wells Fargo this hour. Wells Fargo, the nation's largest mortgage servicer. Among other things, the group of activists are demanding relief for the 11 million homeowners currently underwater. Our next guest has been on the front lines of this fight and just 24 hours ago was arrested for participating in a sit-in. Joining us now is George Gale, the executive director of National People's Action. George, how much does this spring rise that we're seeing at some of these shareholder meetings foretell of increasing engagement from sort of the occupation 2.0, or maybe even that's the wrong word to use, forget the occupation, just ideas of justice regardless of your group identity becoming more present?
I think this is the year we're going to see takeoff. Last time I was on your show, it was right after the J.P. Morgan Chase shareholder meeting last year in Columbus, Ohio. And that was one of maybe 4 or 5 demonstrations at corporate shareholder meetings that spring. This year, there are demonstrations planned at 32 shareholder meetings across the country. More people will mobilize leading up to and at corporate shareholder meetings this spring than at any point in American history. So I think we're finally, and I know you and I have been frustrated that more people haven't really engaged at a high level, I think we're going to finally see a lot more people hit the streets.
And to what do you attribute that confidence or that optimism?
I think that more and more people are making the connection that, you know, government isn't the problem, it's the prize. But right now it sits in the hands of corporations. It sits in a trophy case down on Wall Street. And we can go to government and ask our elected officials to address these issues, or we could say, who's really in charge here? And we think the corporations are in charge. So instead of just going up to Capitol Hill every month and talking to those guys, let's go to the people behind the curtain that are pulling the strings and say, if you want to run our democracy and you want to control our economy, you're going to have to deal with us directly.
Again, I know there are 100, Ari Berman talks about 196 people provide 80% of all the money. I call them the oligarchs because there are 311 million of us, and yet we have 196 people providing that money. What do you think is the next, in other words, if in your fantasy of engagement around the desire to resurrect justice, what are you missing? What do you wish you had? What do you wish existed? What are you looking to make as a tool, a legislative tool, a communications tool, to go beyond the fury of 2011 to the action of 2012 within the keeping of the phrase that, you know, that the response to despair is not hope and it is not anger. The response to despair is action.
That's right. I mean, I think there are 2 things that have to happen that have not been happening. One, we've got to engage millions of people. We got to move from having actions of 100 or 500 or 1,000 people and engage more people. And I think the way we do that is actually going directly to corporations. People know that Wall Street, the financial sectors, but also other big corporations are the drivers behind political and economic inequality. But a lot of time leaders in our movements have not been willing to go directly to those folks, create the tension, challenge them face to face, which is exactly what you can do at a shareholder meeting. That kind of organizing and that kind of action energizes people. It's truth-telling. And I think one of the big problems we've had in the progressive sector is the gap between what people believe and what they're willing to say. And if we start to say the truth and really name who's behind the curtain, I think we're going to energize and move more people. On the question of a policy agenda, there's no doubt that there are specific things that people are lining up around. On the federal policy front, there are big ideas, obviously, around principal reduction. We've talked about that a lot. But also, I think there's a serious movement around breaking up the big banks. And finally, money in politics is like the unifying issue, because whether you work on health care, banks and foreclosures, jobs and worker rights, private prisons, it all comes back to money in politics.
Yeah, it seems like that anti-corruption movement from super PAC transparency at the bottom to the amendment of the Constitution at the top, and then a bunch of notches along the way, revolving door and all the rest of it, it continues to crystallize for folks of all political persuasions as a necessary next act, this anti-corruption movement, along with things like primary participation. I want to read the Wells Fargo statement relative to the engagement at the shareholder meeting. Wells Fargo told us that they have helped more than 740,000 customers with loan modifications and has forgiven $4.1 billion in principal since 2009. over the past year. Less than 2% of owner-occupied loans in our servicing portfolio have resulted in foreclosures. Those are big numbers. How do they stack up to things like the $30 trillion? Like $30 trillion is a lot bigger than $4 billion, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, Wells Fargo, we found them, of the big banks, to be the masters at denial and deflection. They think they've never made a bad loan. They feel like they've never missed a possible loan workout. And so this is part of a repeating pattern with them. We did a demonstration in February that led to a negotiating meeting with their head of corporate social responsibility, John Campbell. And in the middle of the meeting, as community people from across the country were laying out their grievances on a broad set of issues, they asked, when do we get to show our PowerPoint? And that just shows how clueless these guys are in terms of what people are experiencing across the country. And the reason you saw folks risk arrest yesterday, family farmers, retirees, and others, is because they feel like they're experiencing the crisis, but they now need to bring the crisis to Wells Fargo.
And they need to have that be heard. I got to wrap this up, but I do know that there would be more of this. Fair?
Oh, yeah. It's starting tomorrow at GE in Detroit.
All right. Anywhere else that you want to tell anybody about before I let you go? GE in Detroit tomorrow. Sure. Where else?
May 3rd, Verizon in Huntsville, Alabama, and May 9th, Bank of America in Charlotte, North Carolina.
All right. Thanks for the time, and thank you for your leadership in engaging with action beyond that takes us through hope and anger. George Gale, National People's Action. Straight ahead here, our specialist who claims the political environment in Washington isn't just bad for us, it's bad for the earth.